What is up, folks? SolarStrike here, and today we are here to talk about Half-Life 2, a first-person shooter for Windows developed by Valve and published by Sierra and Vivendi Universal Games on November 16th, 2004. The sequel to the extremely popular Half-Life, it is set in an Eastern European setting surrounding a zone known as City 17, of which the world has been taken over by a new alien race known as the Combine, who took advantage of the situation in the first game to get here, and went on to enslave humanity thanks to the help of a man known as Dr. Wallace Breen. You once again play as Gordon Freeman, survivor of the Black Mesa incident, with some intervention from the G-Man, a mysterious being with extraordinary powers, who places him in the setting. Joining him is Alex Vance, a plucky resistance fighter, who fights with Freeman to destroy Combine forces and take down Dr. Breen, with a large cast of characters assisting the two in action. Refining on the aspects that made the first game so successful, such as an even deeper narrative and story, cutting-edge technology like its physics system, a crucial point in the game due to its use of the gravity gun, an object manipulator for many puzzles in the game, its extremely lifelike graphics powered by Valve's new Source engine, such as its first-class lighting effects, texture work, and high-poly models, among other things, and its extensive flexibility, which allowed for even easier community creations to be made. The game would prove to be even more successful than its predecessor, winning all kinds of awards and earning universal acclaim from critics and gamers, as well as kickstarting Valve's digital distribution service, which, despite some initial teething issues, would go on to be the way forward for PC games to be distributed in, all but displacing the old retail model for PC gaming just within a few short years of the game's release. And even then, it still sold millions of copies, 12 million of them by 2011 to be exact. Unfortunately, all this great success came with lots of growing pains and struggles in the 5 years it spent in development, such as botched release dates and promotions, impressive technology demos that wowed audiences that saw them, and even a high-profile leak from one renegade fan. But what happened in that time, and how did the game succeed so well despite all the hardships in development? Well, let's find out. In June 1999, about 7 months after the completion of Half-Life, Project lead Gabe Newell uttered 6 words that would mark the genesis of the game's development. This time, the stakes are different. From the get-go, the game would be setting new benchmarks and redefining the genre just as its predecessor did. From that moment on, tasked to a staff of 81 other members, with an unlimited budget and no deadline, development on the project commenced. Unfortunately, this came with an early loss in development. One of Valve's co-founders, Mike Harrington, who resigned in early 2000. Despite the loss of Harrington causing sad emotions from the team early on, innovation was quickly needed, and so a new fork in the engine from late in Half-Life's development was created with experimental technologies the first game did not have on launch, but would be worked on throughout development of this game, separating the original's Gold Source engine with this new Source engine. This new engine, developed concurrently with the game, would eventually grow to encompass major things such as an advanced physics engine, powered by a middleware known as Havoc, and advanced facial animations as a result of studies from designer Ken Birdwell, who extensively researched facial muscles at New York University in the process of development. Both things would serve the same purpose, to immerse the player into the world of City 17, a setting which took inspiration from Eastern European settings, an objective shared by the game's narrative and characters, again written by Mark Laidlaw, who took minor characters from the first game, due to players strongly resonating with them, and fleshed them out along with the game's new characters into complex and deep relationships and dynamics that made them appear as if they were all a family. With all this groundwork, however, laid a problem within the team. It was now the spring of 2001, and there was no real demo combining all these aspects together, despite 2 years of work passing. That all changed when a breakthrough happened early that summer as a result of experiments in environmental gameplay, which led to a flurry of ideas thought up from the team as a result of a short minigame known as Zombie Basketball, where the game's physics would be used to make a game of basketball from body parts of zombies that had been killed by shooting them through hoops. From this experiment came the game's first real attempt at stress testing the engine from a demo, a city riot between City 17 citizens and Combine forces who had been sent to quell the riots. Despite it being a very early demo, it made extensive use of the game's physics and AI, and would impress Newell so much when the team showed it off to him late that summer that they were tasked to work on a showreel to be completed in the spring of 2002, where if it was good enough, it would be used to demonstrate the game at E3 that summer. And as a result, the team would go off to work on the reel early that fall, while Newell would go off to develop Steam, a game distribution platform over the internet for which developers would receive a much greater cut of the game's profit compared to the traditional retail model. The company would make use of both models for this game and its future titles. It is now March 2002, and the deadline for the showreel had been reached, with the team coming up with a 20-minute sequence showing off the game's physics, environments such as the Borealis, a ship in which the game would initially start in before getting the axe, and most importantly, a sequence set in Dr. Kleiner's lab with its range of storytelling being shown off. Unfortunately for the team, Newell would not be impressed with the reel, and therefore would not debut at E3 2002. For the team, this would prove to be disappointing at first, but would eventually serve as new motivation for them to try again with a new reel that September, with big refinements such as a buggy race around the coast of City 17, and a Strider causing havoc in downtown City 17, ducking under a collapsing bridge to attack. This demo impressed Newell much more than the March reel, sending the team into full-scale development in October with a goal in mind, showing off the game at E3 2003, and getting it released before the end of that year. As a result, the Cabal system from the original game made its return, this time with 3 of the main ones with up to 6 designers each, with one major change from the first game. Level design would be created before the art in each level was to be implemented. That would mean placeholder textures, distinctly all orange, would be used to make the level designs and objects fall into place. Progression on the game would be promising but somewhat arduous, so by February 2003, Newell gave a more solid date, the end of the third quarter of 2003, September 30th. September 30th, 2003. This date would be instilled into the team for months to come, working through unstable and unfinished technology and long hours that would only get even more arduous as time went on. In March 2003, work on the game's E3 demo would begin. Initially a 30-minute demo where Alex would show off all the new features of the Source engine before the lab which this took place would be raided by Combine forces and the player needs to escape before realizing this could not work with the ship date of September 30th, 2003. As a result, a new demo was made mixing some short gameplay snippets with the showcasing of Source's technological improvements with help from graphics card manufacturer ATI, who had partnered with Valve in the interim. Despite the scaled-back ambitions, even this was enough to win Best of Show at the convention that May, which Valve proudly stated the game would release on September 30th, 2003. Yet by midsummer, it was clear the game would not ship by that date, as the game would effectively be cut in half, such as large, ambitious sequences involving vehicles and facial animations, since neither was fully working by then. Internally, it had been decided that the game would not release by its original date, but to the outside world, it had seemed all but certain the game would release on September 30th, 2003, had it not been for the game's publisher, Vivendi Universal Games. This publisher, who had bought Sierra in the years since the original game's release, told retailers that it would release during the 2003 holiday season instead. This set the Half-Life fandom on fire on whether or not the game would make September 30th, 2003. Valve, for their part, would initially stick to their guns and said it would, even as late as August 27th. Designers would say the game would ship on September 30th, 2003, but something had to give, and that would finally happen on September 23rd, 2003, just 1 week before the 30th, when Newell announced the game would not make that date and would instead release that holiday season. This angered many people due to poor handling of the game's release date being delayed, which Valve had hesitated telling people earlier due to a new date not being clear, including partner ATI, who had scheduled a launch party that day on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco. What happened instead was a brief benchmark of Source and a brief speech from Newell. It had seemed Half-Life 2 had disappeared into the abyss, and things would only get worse from there thanks to one renegade German fan. On October 2nd, 2003, the source code for the game was leaked onto the internet, followed by a playable build of the game, which included part of the E3 demonstrations mere days later. This would come from a German hacker known as Axel Gembe, who was a curious superfan of the first game, interested in seeing how the game was going. Under the alias Osama bin Leaker, he was alarmed to find just how far the game was behind. As a result, the game would be delayed to 2004, while Valve turned to the fans to find who did these leaks. Unfortunately for them, the community would still be cross with them over the release date fiasco, and Valve ultimately ended 2003 on a very sour note, with damaged morale within the team. Fortunately, the game would begin to pick up traction when the team reunited in early January 2004, with an alpha build of the game being planned that March, as tools were starting to work properly, despite continuing long-hour workdays. Suddenly, on February 15th, 2004, Newell received an email from a sender known as The Guy. It was Gembe, the hacker who had leaked the game. In his email, he stated he had never intended for things to get as bad as they did, and wanted a job at Valve. Surprisingly, Valve actually agreed to interview him over the phone and quickly sensed potential for his skills, and offered him a second interview at Valve's headquarters in Bellevue that March. Unfortunately for him, it was all a ruse, as this was a plot by Newell to get him onto US soil, where he would be arrested by the FBI. However, German police forces caught wind of this plan and arrested him before he could board the plane, where he would be indicted over his connections over a computer worm which had caused problems across the world, before being put onto 2 years probation in November 2006. Back at Valve, an alpha playtest was finally put into motion, bringing many people from all kinds of places to playtest the game. The playtesting demo, now with many things changed from 2002 and 2003, was a major success for the team after the torment they went through in 2003. Though the game was still not done, and wouldn't be done until at least that fall, the game's development toiled on throughout that summer. By September 30th, 2004, the game's last bugs were being squashed, and the game's development finally wrapped on October 13th, 2004, after 5 years and 3 months in development. Just over a month later, on Tuesday, November 16th, 2004, Half-Life 2 would release to both store shelves and Steam, which both versions would require the latter's services. While this aspect initially annoyed some gamers, this would be viewed as a worthy trade-off, as the game was lauded by critics and gamers for virtually every single aspect, from the narrative and characters to the graphics and physics, as well as the game's gameplay and AI, all of which was universally regarded as top-notch and most certainly worth the wait, fulfilling Newell's intents to re-innovate the genre. It won many Best of 2004 awards, as well as ranking high on Best of Decade and even Greatest of All Time lists, and sold 8.6 million copies at retail by the time of Axel Gembe's trial in November 2006, and 12 million by early 2011, and that's without including digital copies sold on Steam to boot. Thanks to this massive success, much of the team could finally rest easy for a while to prevent burnout, while a new, smaller team would work on the game's multiplayer deathmatch component, eventually releasing 2 weeks later on November 30th, 2004. Shortly thereafter, the game's legacy began in the form of Half-Life 2 Lost Coast, a tech demo level for high dynamic range rendering, a feature that was cut in development for ATI. It was released in October 2005, and a 64-bit version of both this and the main game was released that December. Back in that April, work on 3 episodic sequels began, named Half-Life 2, Episode 1, 2, and 3, which would take place after the main storyline and would showcase new features of the Source engine in the process. Episode 1 would release in June 2006, followed by Episode 2 in October 2007. Unfortunately, Episode 3, which was scheduled for Christmas of that year, or in early 2008, would never come to be due to lack of motivation and innovation within the company on the franchise, sending the company and franchise into circles for 13 years, before finally re-emerging in March 2020 with a virtual reality prequel to Half-Life 2 in the form of Half-Life Alyx, also well acclaimed for yet again, innovating on the first-person shooter from its new perspective. In the meantime, the legacy of the game would become apparent fast, especially after the release of the Source SDK. The game, just like its predecessor, received mods turned products such as Gary's Mod, a sandbox game originally started as a Half-Life 2 mod, The Stanley Parable, a meta-fictional mod which used Half-Life 2 assets before being spun off into its own thing, and Black Mesa, a remake of the original Half-Life from a team unsatisfied with the first game's port to the engine known as Half-Life Source. Content creation within the game continues to remain strong even to this day, many years after the game's release, with other games from Valve such as Team Fortress 2, the Portal duology, the Left 4 Dead duology, and Counter-Strike Global Offensive continuing to adding to the engine's strengths and enhancements throughout the years. The game even received ports to the original Xbox, the Xbox 360, the PlayStation 3, and even Android as time progressed. Of course, these ports still pale in comparison to the PC original, which brought the rise of Steam, of which in its modern form is the go-to way to play games on computers, as other publishers sign on to the service within a few years of a game's release. It is fair to assume that without Half-Life 2, PC gaming would never be quite the same.